$13.50. I have seen or heard or read that statistic so many times online over the past 6 or 7 years, and the discourse surrounding it is infuriating. And I think a lot of the people who get caught up in the discourse on that particular piece of information are genuinely not bad people. There are some people who are disingenuously using it as a way of promoting a certain political agenda, but I do genuinely believe most people are just interested. They just have some questions. So I want to address everyone as best as I can with regards to that number. 1350, of course, is the portmanteau, the shorthand for despite. It always begins with despite. Making up only 13% of the population, black people commit 50% of the violent crimes. Now sometimes people say 52%, and sometimes people will shorten it down to 6% of the population because we're only looking at black men committing a certain percentage of violent crimes. But hey, that's not fair. Men commit more crimes violently no matter what race we're looking at. If we're looking at black people, we need to just look at black people here. So 13%, 1350, 1352 maybe, we'll take on all of it. Now, it is an undeniable fact that black people commit more violent crime in this country than their population would proportionally suggest they should. That is 100% the case. And no matter how many crazy fucking wokelets try to tell you that it all comes down to reporting bias, and I have seen some people say that, they are wrong. Black people do commit a disproportionate amount of crime, though the actual stat is a little bit misleading. I have heard the phrase, despite being 13% of the population, black people commit 50% of the violent crime. It's not actually true. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that only refers to homicides. If we're looking at violent crime, the proportion is actually 37%, and that only refers to arrests. So we're only actually looking at homicides when we're talking about that 52% muddled figure. And even then, we can account for the fact that black people are disproportionately arrested. They get more convictions overturned per capita, which means they're falsely incarcerated more often. There are a lot of really complicated statistical variances that go into that, but all of them don't really distract from the central point, which is that black people commit more crime. They just do, violent crime, by a significant amount. So the first thing that I want to do before jumping into this is acknowledge the discourse that goes on. So there are two types of people who bring up 1350. There are people who do so in good faith, and there are people who do so in bad faith. Unfortunately, the conversation is largely driven by the latter group, which makes progressive people defensive naturally. So here's an example. If you were around on Reddit back in 2014, 2015, 2016, and you ever browsed a thread on the R Politics subreddit, you saw Stormfront copy pasta. We got any old people in chat? I remember it fondly. Anytime you would scroll through those threads, anytime it had anything to do with race, you would eventually find the comment. It was the same comment every time because it was copy pasta. It was a copy-pasted document that was circulated amongst neo-Nazis on the website Stormfront, a neo-Nazi website, so named for Der Stürmer, a Nazi newspaper, And what it was this big copy-paste list of black crime statistics. They were throwing darts at the wall, whatever stuck, black people commit more crime, and also the black rate of incarceration, and also black people jaywalk more often. It was just like a whole smorgasbord of statistics. Most of them were either misleading, out of context, or outright falsified. And some of them were very outdated. Some of those stats were from the 1960s. I mean, a half century ago, That's hardly representative of modern, demographic behaviors. But whatever the case was, I would see that all the time. And the first statistic thrown out every one at the top of this list of 20, 30 statistics, despite making up 13% of the population, and so on, every single time. Now, when I hear people say 1350 or despite or black crime or anything like that, the way they bring it up tells me a lot about their intentions. When those Stormfront people go into those forums and they copy paste it and they spread it around, they're not interested in having a discourse on the sociological causes of black crime. They're not interested in addressing the problem. They're neo-Nazis. We know what they're actually trying to do. They're trying to sow the seeds that black people are inherently violent, and then from that, a number of conclusions naturally follow in their worldview, whether an apartheid state, the deportation of black people, or in some cases, and this was openly advocated for in Stormfront, so it's not exactly a minority opinion, just the overt genocide of black people in the United States. And they lay the groundwork for that by getting people to think, man, why do black people commit so much crime? And depending on the answers you're given, you can go in one of many directions. And I'm going to give answers to that. But first, I want to really hit down on the discourse surrounding this particular issue. Because fuck me, dude. When you bring up a social problem, usually it's done to elucidate an issue or to find a solution. That's generally what you do. Like when you say something along the lines of, well, children in this neighborhood aren't eating breakfasts as often, so it's affecting their school performance, or something like that. If I were to hear that sentence, it would usually be in the context of a discussion meant to either explain a given issue or find a solution to a given issue. That's generally how those things come up. This doesn't seem to be the case with the 1350 crowd. Usually, it is being done to bring about one of three outcomes. Either one, it's being thrown out of context, like those Stormfront people, to get people thinking, why do black people commit so much crime? For two, it's being done as a lazy post hoc justification for accusations of racism. When people like me go ahead and say, oh my God, black people are being oppressed, they're being shot, they have disproportionately low income, unemployment, then somebody can walk in and say like, 1350. Presumably to shut down the conversation. And the third group of people who bring it up, I think, are genuinely interested in why that number might be so disproportionate. So, first, I will acknowledge the first true groups who act in bad faith. First of all, we must recognize the fact that if we are talking about social problems, there are only two possible causes. 50-50. That's how it works. Environmental and genetic. That's it. Those are the only two things anything can be. Any social problem, any whatsoever, can be boiled down to one of those two factors, or both of those factors in varying degrees. For example, men commit a massively disproportionate amount of violent crime, way more than black people compared to white people. We're fucking monsters compared to black people if we're just looking at average crime statistics. That's crazy. But people don't tend to talk that much about genociding all men or putting laws on men that are disproportionately strict. In fact, I've actually noticed the type of people who have such an issue with black crime rates also think the courts discriminate against men, particularly family courts, which is an interesting juxtaposition of ideas because, man, I mean, like I said, men are disproportionately way more likely to commit violent crime than women. I mean, that disparity is massive. So maybe we could derive some policy positions from that. Now, I don't want that. I think the difference in violent crime committing rates between men and women are largely a product of social forces, and there might be some genetic forces in there as well. Generally speaking, men are larger and stronger, and we do generally have higher rates of aggression. How much is that society? How much is that genetics? We don't really know, but we can work on the problems as we see them. After all, the majority of black crime is also being committed by men, by young black men. So conceivably, if we could find a way to alleviate any social factors that are increasing criminality and violence amongst young men, that would go across the board to also disproportionately affect the black community. That's how I like to think of an issue, you know? I'm a sociologist. I graduated. That's my I'm not a sociologist, but I have a degree. And that's how I like to think of issues following my graduation. We take a look at an issue, we find a cause, and we think of a solution. We don't assign blame. I don't ever assign blame. I try to find explanations, but I'm not interested in blaming men for why men do more violence. And in fact, if you go through the entire history of my channel, in which I have made multiple mentions to men's disproportionate propensity towards committing violent crime, you will find that I have never just blamed men. You'll also find I don't just blame cops, much as I don't blame black people. I blame social issues underlying our behavior, because that's what we have control over. Blaming people doesn't really fix anything. Finding solutions does. There's one more sort of preemptive issue that I want to address before I actually get into the meat of 1350. When it comes to, I am racist against British people. That is true. When it comes to the people who just post 1350 out of context, many of them have a genetic explanation for the disproportionate rate of crime committed by black people. Obviously, if they're from Stormfront, they're not coming here thinking, well, I think sociologically poverty influences their culture. No. They have a reason. It's all up here, okay? So to those people, I have two things to say. First of all, stay mad. Still absolutely no evidence of an inherent IQ gap between the races that can't be alleviated through socioeconomic conditions. And with every passing study, the gap seems to be getting closer and closer. Really sorry. No race war today. And second of all, there are so many people, and I think this actually applies to every group, who say this. Tell me if you've heard this before, folks. Please tell me if you've heard this before. The left gets so triggered when I just post facts. These are just statistics. They're from the government. The left gets so mad. They're so triggered by facts. A couple of points to that. First of all, I'm as progressive, soy boy, whatever as it comes. I have never once been offended by acknowledging black people commit more crime. To me, and again, this could be a part of my education, it's natural to me. If I had never heard before that black people committed more crime in this country, and then somebody told me, I would think oh, okay, yeah, well, that makes sense given a lot of other factors that we're about to discuss, you know? It's not offensive to me, and I've never been offended at the discussion. In fact, I revel in discussing the causes behind all of that. The issue is people get defensive when people disingenuously evoke the black crime argument in an effort to imply a genetic explanation. And that's what they tend to get offended by. So if somebody comes up to me and they're like, hey, can we have a conversation about 1350? I'm good. Yeah, sure. In fact, I've done it on the stream, and I love doing it on the stream. I have a great deal of, I have a tremendous amount of fun doing it because I have a lot of collected data on that particular issue. But if somebody just drops in and says 1350 and drops out, I know what they're implying, okay? They're just stating facts. Well, the factuality of a claim doesn't actually have anything to do with its implications or how offensive it is. Here's an example. Imagine you're on Twitter, okay? And you're watching a heated conversation between a white person and a black person, okay? They're arguing, it's not even a race argument or whatever. They're just arguing over some dumb shit. And the white person posts a picture of the Klan standing in front of a burning cross, and they say, 100 years ago, people like you probably would have been getting some of this. I mean, that's technically true. That is technically a factually correct. That's true. 100 years ago, if a black person was arguing fervently with a white person, that's about as good a reason as any for the Klan to lynch somebody, right? Or burn a fucking cross in their lawn. That's technically true. But let's not be children here. Let's not be fucking morons here. We know what the implication is, okay? They're not just stating a historical fact, extigent any conceivable implication. They're implicitly making a threat. And likewise, when people throw the 1350 out, like a little like a little glitter bomb, they're not doing it to bring up a nuanced sociological conversation. Very often, they're just doing it to imply a genetic explanation. So, for those people, stay mad. Still no evidence. Sorry, century of data collecting. All your fucking heroes on skull shapes and IQ measurements turned out to be hacks, and all their data has been disproven post-mortem. Oh, must hurt. Sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm getting sympathetic heartburn just imagining somebody unironically defending the genetic explanation for crime disparities between black and white people in light of the past century of evidence debunking every conceivable post hoc justification that racist white scholars have come up with. You can try and find data if you want. I've dug through all of it. So, have fun with that. I want to focus on the people who actually care about 1350. Like the people, and I see a lot of this on TikTok. There are people who bring it up and genuinely seem to be using it as some kind of explanation for the disparities that we see in this country. Like, oh, well, of course police do that. Of course neighborhoods are like that. So let's talk about that. Why 1350? Why do black people commit so much crime? Well, it's a complicated and multivariate issue. One of the issues sociologists have with regards to studying this is that it's very difficult to find like populations. You see, the vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, of black violent crime takes place in very poor, very urban environments. The ghettos, the inner city. Very tenements stacked together, packed tight, very high levels of over-policing, high levels of gang criminality. This is where, sometimes these houses literally had lead paint in them, which we've been phasing out now, but the impacts of lead paint on people who live in those environments, especially during natal development and, like early childhood, are astonishing. Really bad stuff. So with that being said, the issue is nobody's really going to understand why black people commit so much crime unless they're willing to acknowledge the fact that there can be a dozen or dozens of interconnected social and political conditions that can lead to a very severe disparity. This is why sociologists engage in something called multivariate regression analysis. It's one of the most useful mathematical tools people who do my sort of thing have, and I've totally forgotten how to do it, but I remember what it is. Multivariate regressive analysis is the statistical process of isolating the effects of a given variable in a complex environment, So if you want to take a look at a big swath of data and you want to say, okay, well, how important was the person's height? Let's say we're looking at basketball stats, like what is the relationship between performance and height? Well, we've got a bunch of other factors to correlate in there too, like weight, for example, or what about like where they came from, or like what if we want to go even more specific? What about childhood nutrition? Can we get data on the childhood nutrition for all the people who have been playing in this particular like population of basketball players? Can we like pull from that and like isolate one variable from dozens of others? Well, the answer is we can, but it's really fucking hard. It's a very difficult thing to do. Which is why you need to have a degree to do it. And since I forget, I guess you don't just need a degree, you need a degree and a good memory. But the point is, that's the process by which we try to figure out how these individual data points come together to bring about a given conclusion. So let's talk about black crime. Black crime in America, this is going to surprise you, used to be pretty much zero. The reason for that was because black people weren't citizens and couldn't commit crimes because they were slaves. Really difficult to commit. I'll tell you, hey, listen, if you want to address crime in this country, enslave all men. Whew. Listen, it sounds extreme, but consider the benefits. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, how much crime can you fucking commit when you're a slave? On it, like, you're on a I was going to say tight leash, but I think that might be a little on the nose. When slavery ended, the Jim Crow era began. And now we live in an era of what is essentially apartheid in the United States of America, or at least something very similar to apartheid. Now, at that time, black crime was not particularly high, and the black crime that did exist was mostly crime of subsistence living. So I think we can acknowledge the difference between like a robbery and like stealing bread. Stuff like that, petty theft and interpersonal disputes, which are always a component of living in a society. Those tended to be like black crime back in the early Jim Crow era, the 1880s, the 1890s, and what have you. Now, no issue yet, right? Black people didn't really have the social power necessary to make any like criminal will manifest, but that changed back during the turn of the 20th century. We had the Great Migration, which, as those of you who did not sleep through history class might remember, was a migration of literally like millions of black people from the south to the north, because for aforementioned social reasons, a lot of black people were in the south, and for other aforementioned social reasons, a lot of them didn't like it. So they moved up north. There were a lot of jobs up north, and the factories that were being built up there, that's how it works. And when millions of very poor, very discriminated against people, Jim Crow era, we're not exactly post-racism yet, or ever, very specific sociological and criminological conditions tend to arise. Now, initially, when black people did the Great Migration and they moved up north, they lived in these rundown tenements. They lived essentially in the ghettos of the turn of the 20th century north. And they shared those ghettos with the Irish and the Italians. Because the Irish and the Italians were in a very similar position, a historically discriminated against group, at least here in the United States of America, who came over en masse and ended up settling in the north for jobs. They were all shacked together in the same basic communities. Though it should be noted that even in those communities, the Irish and the Italians were still very okay being shitty to black people. It's not like they all just got along perfectly. And you know what happened back during the early 20th century? A massive, massive rise in criminality and gang violence on the part of the Italians and the Irish. I mean, I need not, perhaps the mafia, a household name, I need not remind you. The issue is, when you're very poor, when you don't have a high employment rate, when you live in poorly regulated shit-ass tenements where you're constantly being beleaguered by the police, sometimes criminality is the way you get ahead in life. And it was around that time, and I forget the specific year, so I apologize for the roughness of my recollection here, that drugs were made illegal in the United States. I think it was it 1913 or something like that? Here, hold on. I'm actually going to Google that because I'm curious. When was opium made illegal in U.S.? The International Opium Convention, that was in 1935? Oh, that's, no, that was when President Roosevelt hailed it. Ten years later, made it illegal to... There we go. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, the first major piece of U.S. legislation to control the sale and use of opiates, was passed. 10 years later, in the Anti-Heroin Act of 1924, Congress made it illegal to make, import, or sell heroin when it passed in the Anti-Heroin Act of 1924. So between that and prohibition, I mean, gods, we know about prohibition, right? The criminality of drug sales and drug manufacturing led to an explosion in the gang rate, the rate of like gang proliferation in the North, because people like alcohol, people like drugs, This is the exact same problem that we have today. Because shit like cocaine is illegal here in the States, but people still like cocaine, as it turns out, we have to get all of our shit from dealers, drug manufacturers that come from places like Mexico, which means we empower the cartels, or sometimes south of Mexico because they get run through from Southern America. And what that means is the only way to distribute those goods in the United States of America is for the dealers and for the cartels to distribute their drugs to local sellers who are capable of running an underground criminal network without getting caught by the police. Gangs. That was what they did. That's their job. The connection between gang sales and drug manufacturing led to an explosion in the gang rate, the rate of like gang proliferation in the North, because people like alcohol. People like drugs. This is the exact same problem that we have today. Because shit like cocaine is illegal here in the States, but people still like cocaine, as it turns out, we have to get all of our shit from dealers, drug manufacturers that come from places like Mexico, which means we empower the cartels, or sometimes south of Mexico because they get run through from Southern America. And what that means is the only way to distribute those goods in the United States of America is for the dealers and for the cartels to distribute their drugs to local sellers who are capable of running an underground criminal network without getting caught by the police. Gangs. That was what they did. That's their job. The connection between gang proliferation and the illegality of contraband, of drugs, of alcohol, what have you, is substantial. But black criminality wasn't that high back then, at least with regards to gang violence, though black people, of course, had their same, domestics and interpersonal disputes as ever. This swell in black crime, this hadn't really happened yet. Anyway, time goes on and prohibition ends, and the mob gets a little disempowered, and we move westward more substantially. And there were gangs in the South and in the West, but back then gangs didn't have the same intrinsic association with criminality that we understand them to today. I shit you not, and you can look this up if you want, but a gang back in like 1914 Los Angeles, like they would have been called like the Billy Boy Gang, and their crime would have been like leaning against the saloon and spitting. That would have been it. Like like the gangs were, I swear to God, like they were literally just like hoodlums. I'm not joking. Like that, they were all like the cool kids of the block, They had their zoots and their glasses, and they'd all chill at 15. Yeah. I'm serious. Yeah, no, it were, because they were like just young, discontented fucking kids. They were like running, I don't know, fucking sugar pops from one end of town to another. But obviously, the gang proliferation up in the North, up where there were these very, very big, very dense cities with high concentrations of urban poor, those gangs were a lot more serious because, again, criminality and gang proliferation are heavily associated with certain social conditions. The Irish and the Italians didn't stay in the ghettos forever. Eventually, they were nominated by the Pope to be white. They got knighted and they were made white. And the Irish and the Italians more or less integrated, or at least more substantively integrated into American whiteness. There is a phenomenal book, whose name I don't remember, maybe you guys do, on the development of whiteness in the Irish and the Italian communities back during the 1930s and 40s and 50s. It's really, really fascinating. I read it in college, but essentially, like, when lefties say whiteness is exclusionary, this is kind of what they mean. Whiteness is like a tool that you can bequeath onto people. It's a status symbol when they aren't inconvenient to your social system. But the Irish and the Italian they were pretty deeply inconvenient at the time they all came off the boat, because they were a fuck ton of poor people who, at least in the case of the Italians, didn't speak English that well. And of course, nobody can understand the Irish, so the effect was functionally the same. But as they get involved more, as they, integrate more thoroughly into the American white culture, they get accepted into it. And who is left now to remain in the ghettos but the black people, being left with what is essentially this cultural remnant of criminality and gang networking that they, as an ethnic group, now have a more or less complete holdover in those given communities. You see, it wasn't that the Irish and the Italian had a particular kink in their brain that made them develop the gangs back during the turn of the 20th century. It's that they had just enough social power and the poverty and the inner city poor, conditions that they could manifest into a network that they used for criminality, which enriched their communities tremendously. There's a reason why, people often love like their mafia group. You guys know that stereotype, right? Like all the Italians, they love the mafia, like back in the day. The reason for that was because the mafia made an explicit effort to protect the communities that they came from. That was their defense. They would make an active effort to enrich the communities they came from because that was their stock. That was where they pulled their people from. If you're an 18-year-old boy and you grow up in a poor, like Irish, like or Italian community, the mafia wants you to think like, okay, well, I could go into baking or I could join the Don or something like that. You want to be thought of in high regard. That PR work, that social networking is an essential component of managing like a gang network. You can't just be crazy and hateful all the time everywhere. If you do that, nobody's going to fucking support you. Civilians aren't going to keep you in their housing. People are going to rat on you. People are going to call the cops on you. You need to have a community that loves you. So the Irish and the Italian integrate a little bit more. World War II comes around. Fantastic time to better integrate yourself into Americana. The Irish and the Italians serve extensively in the armed forces. So too do Black Americans. And for what it's worth, Black Americans, again, at this time, their rate of crime was very well in line with what you would expect for people in their socioeconomic situation. It was by no means heavily disproportionate. Black Americans, ran off and actually got a little bit of clout. They clout chased in the war. And I can't necessarily blame them. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to racially discriminate against people who have literally saved your life in battle. Of course, most of the regiments were segregated, but many of the Black military units went on to receive very high honors for their performance. And when they came back home, they were not included in a lot of the benefits that World War II veterans got. So that sucks. Because the post-war economic boom for veterans was literally like they were literally like the building blocks for what would then become like the next 20 to 30 years of America. When we think of the boomers and the silent generation, when we think of everything, when we think of American suburbia, when we think of the American dream, all of that, the house, the white picket fence, the 2.5 kids, the dog, all of that comes from economic promises that were made to veterans after they came back from World War II. We built out suburbia. We gave these people educations. We gave them homes. And frankly, awesome. Great. The soldiers in World War II fought off fascists. Fuck yeah, give them houses. I don't care. Though I do hate suburbia. Still, great. But, if you want to go and look back over the numbers, there just weren't that many high to middle income Black suburbs that were built back in the 1950s. Just not a super common thing that happened, unfortunately. So where are we at right now? We're in the 1950s. Due to policies like redlining, the majority of Black people in this country, or at least a highly disproportionate amount, are still committed to these very high density, very low income urban areas, whereas white people, many of them at least, were allowed to disperse into the newly created suburbia that stretched across the breadth of the American Great Plains, meaning that the disparity between which groups of people occupied which parts of the country grew even wider. Redlining in those cities was a process by which Black people were cordoned off to certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods were not excellent neighborhoods. And as we roll back the 1940s, the 1950s, when I say Great Plains, I was being a little evocative there. Literally, the Great Plains today are not particularly densely populated. And as we roll into what is considered, I guess, to be like closer to the modern era, which is now when we actually have more accurate crime reporting stats, because we were shit at that 100 years ago. Find me some reliable data on criminality back in the 1910s than they are in addressing the underlying sociological conditions which led to this because of the criminal justice system, which, as my document, and you all can access it if you click !doc in chat, or if you type that out, which irrevocably proves the fact, or irrefutably, proves the fact that the criminal justice system is unjustly biased against black people, both in forms of implicit bias and in the outcomes of pre-existing social conditions that they fail to account for. If you take all of these conditions, if you collect all of them, and you account for every single thing, what you will find, and this seems to be, I think, for the most part, the consensus of academia, is that black people, for all their criminality, are behaving pretty much exactly the way that you would expect people would, given their conditions. And I ask you, because if there's a problem, this is because I'm a big boy, I'm an adult. If there's a problem in our country, what do we focus on? Do we complain about it, or do we try to fix it? Do we just sit here and blithely assume that every crime committed in a black community is a post hoc justification for the conditions that they experience? Or do we work to fix the problem? It's my can-do American spirit, okay? That's what I care about. And there are potential solutions that can be thrown out here. Better educational investment, higher investment in contraceptions and education on contraceptions, very, very good idea. All one needs to do is look at the Republican states that teach abstinence-only education to understand how well that pans out in terms of out-of-wedlock births, okay? We need to do a better job investing and developing and incentivizing certain welfare programs. Welfare is good. It has to be the right welfare, though. By the way, black crime and black single-parent household rates both rose when welfare was cut during the 1980s. So the common Republican talking point that welfare is incentivizing black people to just stay at home and be do-nothings is factually not the correct answer. It's just not true. It's just not borne out in the data. Sorry. What we need to do is we need to put the welfare there. We need to make sure it's good welfare, properly incentivized, and then we need to correlate it with a bunch of other forms of socioeconomic investment. And if we do that, and we should want to do that, I believe we can fix a long-standing racial disparity in this country. Can we fix everything? Of course not. No, life can never be that fair. But we can make an effort to improve things. It's so frustrating for me when people who will unironically tell me that black people should be responsible for their own problems will then say that schools are biased against men because women are starting to get higher college test scores. I've actually heard people repeat both of those positions in the same video or in the same conversation. Let me ask you something. If poor people in this country have a problem, whose responsibility is it to fix it? When black people have a problem in this country, whose responsibility is it to fix it? When women in this country have a problem, whose responsibility is it to fix it? The answer is all of us. We share the same country, and we work together to solve the problems we face. If you want to be purely Machiavellian about it, if you want to be just purely cynical, better investment in black communities would be a massive benefit to the U.S., not only because it would lead to fewer people in prison, which would mean less money spent in the criminal justice system, which would mean less overburdening of our court system, meaning that more cases could actually go to trial rather than just being plea bargained, would also mean less money being spent in police departments, would also mean literally millions more people who can, highly educated, highly trained people who can fill necessary work slots in our ever increasingly complex, service-driven economy. If you just want to talk about like hardline benefits that fix like things for everyone, there's no reason not to do this. Every dollar invested in social service programs in underfunded black neighborhoods puts back like $7 or $8 on average. We get like a 8 times investment return over time from these investments. It is a slam dunk. And this veiled like conservative counter argument, well, what happened to personal responsibility? Don't be a fucking idiot, Of course, black people should take personal responsibility. So should everyone. The difference is people in predictable conditions will make predictable outcomes. That's just how the world works. If we fix the conditions, we can fix the outcomes. It is that simple. This blasé default to, oh, well, what if they just fix their own problems, is a lazy way to avoid acknowledging the fact that there are things we can do to make this country materially better. It's just that simple. And I do believe that many of the people who cite this 1350 thing as though it's some kind of counter-argument are not themselves racist. They do not themselves have some sort of deep-seated bias against black people. And that's fine, and I respect that, and that's totally okay. And you know what? If you want to preach personal responsibility, go for it. But if we're talking about policy, if we're talking about actually fixing the country, tell me, what exactly does it do to say people should take more responsibility? Really think about that. Imagine you have the power to affect change. What does that do exactly? You're just sitting there. What should we do about the black community? Well, I think they should try harder. Nailed it. Really, bringing us to the great beyond there, huh? But hey, if you want black people to exercise more personal responsibility, I don't even know what that means. It's such a nebulous qualifier. What does it mean to exercise? Can you find like a stat on that? I don't know what that means. If you want black people to exercise more personal responsibility, you know what correlates with better life decisions? To say, hey, the black community should do this or should be more like this. And then somebody walks up to you and says, we can do that. We just need to do this really simple investment that we know will pay out in every other conceivable way and will only make the country better, and it will do the thing you want them to do. And you're like, no, I don't think so. A little weird. Bit of a weird departure there. I do think a lot of the people who do not otherwise commit to this position, I do believe a lot of these people believe there to be a genetic explanation. They just won't admit it. Not all of them, but I do think some of them believe this to be the case. But the old sociological adage does hold true. If it's genetic, prove it. And if it's environmental, we can fix it. And those are the only two routes to take. So, yeah. Why 1350? Because of the inexorable tide of history, a tide which we have the power to stop, but for the past century have not only failed to do so, but have actively contributed to. That's it. And by we, by the way, and I want to make this very clear, I mean America. And everyone in it, not white people. This has nothing to do with a race war. A lot of conservatives default to that too. Oh, you want to help black people? You want them to take money from white people. Nah, this is our country. It's all of our countries, okay?